workshop for the USU on Black history. We talked last time on the first two phases of racial caste in America. The first one was enslavement, which was a legal form of an inferior status. It wasn't equal to second-class citizenship, and instead it was equivalent to no citizenship and no human rights. The second phase that we discussed was Reconstruction in the Jim Crow era, in which we saw the United States federal government usher in a legal system of second-class citizenship for African Americans. Once again, human rights were compromised, and their African Americans' right to citizenship practices and rights were denied. And so we saw in each of those phases, African Americans' political, social, and cultural activism is really what helped change and transform American society. But those things didn't go unchallenged. We saw major backlash in both instances that resulted in major attacks on Black bodies, Black lives, and hence it leads us to the current call for the Black Lives Matter movement, because there's a continuation with the systematic oppression of African people in this country, but not just African people. We see that for our Latinx brothers and sisters, all of them, not just the brothers and sisters, but whatever identity that individuals identify with. We see this happening. We see this among our indigenous populations as well. And so talking about the current crisis is important to help us contextualize why there is a call, for instance, for anti-racial society, why there is a call to defund the police, and why there is a continuous call for reparations for African Americans. And so that's what we'll discuss today, the third phase of the racial caste system, which Michelle Alexander coins as mass incarceration. So thank you all for joining us again. All right, so remember, if Michelle Alexander is saying that mass incarceration should be considered a form of racial caste because it in fact places people in a legal system of enslavement and results in second-class citizenship, especially if they're labeled a felon. And so the philosophy, how did we get there? How did we get to mass incarceration, not just incarceration? Well, really, during Reconstruction in the Jim Crow era, the prison industrial complex really replaced the free labor that was being provided under enslavement. So you saw sharecropping in the prison industrial complex replacing, all right, the free labor that was being provided under enslavement. And so what you saw was that you saw masses of African American men in particular, but women also, being ushered into the prison system for quote unquote social crimes against whites, which they could be accused of any crime. And they didn't have the ability to defend themselves in a court of law. They could not testify against whites and so on and so forth, as we discussed. Unfortunately, this heightened into mass incarceration as we entered a phase of launching a war on drugs. And the ironic thing is, what took place was during the civil rights era, the philosophy of civil disobedience, of using one's social power to disrupt. That's why you see protests in the street, boycotting what's happening, and so on and so forth. It's designed to disrupt the normal social order of things in order to get the larger message across, right? It's designed to shut down businesses. It's designed to shut down streets and access to major industries and so on and so forth, in order to call the public, and not just the American public, but international attention to the larger issue at hand, which is racial injustice in this society. And so unfortunately, that philosophy of civil disobedience was then coined the leading cause of crime in America. Ironically, the result of that was to launch a war on drugs. So if you wonder, why is it that you launch a war on drugs if you're saying civil disobedience is the leading cause of crime? We'll unpack that today in our lecture. So what you saw was the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, equaled a threat to law and order, because what they were calling for was to restructure the police department, restructure policing that we talked heavily about, and how it was used to terrorize Black people into submission, into a second-class citizenship status. And so what we get in the 21st century is a form of second-class citizen based on your criminal record, and in particular, your felony record. So we'll lay out how the second-class citizenship status takes effect once you're branded a felon, In fact, there are more people on probation or parole than in jail, as an illustration, and more people under systems of corrections, probation, parole, and jail and prisons than there were enslaved in 1865, right? And so this is part of the irony of all of this that we're talking about, is that you see Black bodies being ushered into a ushered under state control once again, which you saw previously with the two prior racial caste systems. So they're ultimately given a badge of inferiority with their felony record. They're banned from public housing. In most cases, they lose the right to serve on juries permanently in some states. In other states, they have to petition for their right to be able to vote or serve on juries once again. But in many states, you lose the right to vote as well. You can be discriminated against by private landlords. So if you think about it, so you don't have any control over the laws. You don't have access to public housing. Private landlords can discriminate against you. You're ineligible for food stamps. You're forced to check the felony record on employment applications. And more recently, in the last 10 years, we've seen employers now even using past arrests as another way to discriminate. So even if you don't have a felony record, if you've ever been arrested, and those arrests, you have to report that even if the arrest was for unpaid parking ticket, as an illustration. So now they're using your felony record and any arrest record, even if it was a faulty arrest and charges were dropped against you in that sense. So you don't have access to housing, you don't have access to good employment, you don't have access to food provided by the state, and you're denied licenses for a wide range of professions. And on top of that, you're ineligible for free financial aid. So if you can't access education, you can't get a job, you can't find housing, you have limited access to food. What is that but second-class citizenship, and what does that result to but anything other than a rise in reincarceration rates? So we see recidivism rates are extremely high when individuals don't have access to these basic human resources needed to survive: housing, food, they need employment to be able to provide for themselves, and so on and so forth. And in American society, you need access to education in order to advance in any sector. And so you can't even get a license in most states to even be an electrician, as an illustration. And so when you think about what that means to be a second-class citizen, it means that you are no longer entitled to the rights and privileges of full citizenship. Does that not sound like what we discussed before, how African Americans have been denied the access to full citizenship privileges? The right to housing, we discussed. The right to equal employment, we discussed that. The right to public services and public resources, we've discussed those things as well. And so if you think about this in terms of a larger scheme, Alexander is correct that mass incarceration is a new phase of racial caste in America. So let's dive a little bit deeper into this one. So how did we get to this? How do we create this system of mass incarceration? By mass incarceration, we mean incarcerating individuals by the hundreds of thousands to the millions, right? So we're no longer in the hundreds of thousands, we're in the millions of individuals being incarcerated on an annual basis. And so how did we get here? Well, one, the war on drugs began simply as a political slogan by Nixon. It was not an actual war on drugs when Nixon first introduced this. However, it quickly shifted to an actual war under Reagan's administration, which was a part of his campaign. Remember that previous slide that you see Reagan's campaign slogan, "Let's make America great again." Some of the stickers and also say, "Just make America great again," exactly as the current president's campaign slogan from his presidential election. You saw that Reagan was shifting as well, shifting to a more militarized police state. And so what you saw is, despite the fact that drug crimes were on a decline, Reagan went forward with launching an actual war on drugs. And for a while, there was no war to fight. That's part of the irony in it. So police began to be geared with cash and military equipment in order to foster this war on drugs, because they were really, remember, drug crimes were on a decline, right? And yet, so the police, there really wasn't a large need for the American police force, right, and law enforcement to pursue this war. And so they begin to be incentivized in that way with cash and equipment. And then we saw the creation of SWAT teams as well. Now the SWAT teams became a militarized police team that would use technical measures to target and eliminate drug threats, quote unquote, in the community. Part of the in communities. Part of the irony with this is that the assumption was that the war on drugs was largely targeting kingpins. Very untrue. We look at the data and we see that the majority of drug arrests were for minor possession of drugs and minor attempted distribution of drugs, but primarily minor possession. Very rare do we see cases of kingpins, although there are a lot of made-for-TV movies that make us believe that there's this larger American war on drugs for these king and queen pins. I don't want to leave the females who participate in drug crimes out, but the large assumption is that they're largely targeting these kingpins, these major drug dealers, when in fact, the majority of arrests are for minor possession of these drugs. So we saw immediately a transformation from community policing to a military policing. And so when we look at it in that sense, then you can understand why in Ferguson, for example, you saw military tanks roll out into the community. So I mentioned before in the last presentation that America has gone to war on Black communities. When you think about some of the signs of war, there's generally a public announcement, right? In this case, the announcement that we're launching a war on drugs, right? There's also the call to the military, and then it was in this case, the war on drugs, you saw the actual military come in, as well as the police department being transformed into a military policing, right? And so you see the military comes in. You also attempt to elicit public buy-in as well. And so there was a major call for the public to accept this war on drugs and accept this type of military policing against African Americans and Latinos in particular. And so how did the public get bought into this type of approach is largely through media over sensationalizing the representations of Black and Latinos as the criminal drug offenders of America. And we'll dive into that as well. So we saw, although drug crimes were on a decline and the war on drugs was a political slogan, it actually became a war despite the fact that those drug crimes are on the decline. So what did we get with the war on drugs? Well, what we got was that there was a shift from segregation to crime. Remember, law enforcement was primarily focused on, during the Jim Crow era, maintaining segregation, right? Maintaining the separation between races and upholding policies, laws, and rules that restricted and prohibited Blacks from accessing free citizenship rights. So instead, you saw race-based crime policies with race-neutral terms. Now it's not segregation, whites only, and so on and so forth. Instead, it's the war on drugs. Well, what's appealing about these race-neutral terminologies was that you could eliminate the idea or buy into the idea that maybe the civil rights movement was successful and that there's no longer a direct targeting. But when you take a look and unpack the war on drugs, you actually see that the war on drugs approach was in fact a war targeting African American and the Latinx community. But it didn't just end there. We saw this shift from to race-based crime policies in race-neutral terms to also welfare reform being labeled at falsely labeled as Blacks as undeserving, and then 5-year limits were put on welfare resources. So the idea of the stereotype of the welfare queen was also introduced by Reagan during his presidency, and really before, and it worked like a charm. What you saw was that these two approaches saying that he needs to be tough on crime, and essentially saying, I'm going to be tough on the Black community. I'm going to eliminate their use of public resources such as welfare, and I'm going to criminalize private poverty, right? In order to restrict African Americans' access to citizenship and resources. So many people falsely have accepted the assumption that the welfare queen stereotype is in fact a factual based assumption or reality about African American women. It is not. In fact, welfare was created for European immigrants and white women, right? And they were the majority recipients. And from the creation of welfare to present day 2020, African American women have never been the majority recipients of welfare, right? And so that's part of the irony. Instead, what you'll get is 36% of African Americans are on welfare and 34% of white Americans are on welfare. Well, white Americans represent over 63% of the US population, so 34% of that larger population is a lot more than 34% of the 13%, the 36%, excuse me, of the 13% population of African Americans. So it's just a manipulation of the data that you see in the news and reports, and in some research articles as well. It's faulty claims about African American women abusing the system. And so you saw Reagan and Clinton, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton, both, all three, excuse me, targeting Black women as the face of welfare and the need to be reformed. Ironically, whenever these services are accessed by African Americans, they're called welfare, right? And they're saying that there's an unhealthy level of dependency. But we see those same types of public welfare being issued to the middle and upper class Americans, particularly largely benefited by white Americans, but they're called tax breaks, for example. They're called bailouts, as an illustration. They're given different terminology and they're more socially acceptable because they're being given to a certain population. So that's part of the irony here. So when you think about the war on drugs, it really became a war on Blacks. And by doing that, you needed to distinguish what type of drugs you were talking about. And so hence came in the idea of the crack epidemic. You saw during this time frame a decline in employment opportunities, discrimination in housing and education, and then you also saw the Personal Responsibility Act. This idea that you're personally responsible for you and your family's well-being and not the government. Hence the reduction to the 5-year limit on welfare resources. You see here in the chart that the change in the number of arrests of Black Americans in the United States between 2011 and 1980 in terms of category of crime, you see the crime rates dramatically increased once the war on drugs was launched in terms of, and things like property crimes and violent crimes are on the decline, but yet drug abuse violations and possession of drug paraphernalia and other crimes were on a major rise, right? So there's a major difference between these two eras, between 1980 and 2011, and they're only increasing. And so this assumption that the war on drugs is about violent crimes is a faulty assumption, because the majority of drug arrests are in fact for non-violent drug possession. Excuse me. So how did we move from a society in which we were seeing Blacks as inferior in terms of being inability to exist in the same social setting as white, to once again marketing this, but under race neutral terminology called the war on drugs? Well, we did this by making the face of drug crimes Black. So there was a focus on crack. In fact, the Federal Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 issued in a 100-to-1 crack versus powder cocaine citizen disparity. Crack cocaine was a less potent, much cheaper, cut the cost of the drug by 80%. A much cheaper drug to purchase than cocaine, but yet there is a 100-to-1 disparity in the sentencing. So you saw the distribution of 5 grams of crack equal to a federal mandatory minimum of 5 years in prison, whereas the distribution of 500 grams of powder cocaine equaled a 5-year minimal sentence. So there's a huge difference. You have to have 500 grams of powder cocaine versus 5 grams of crack cocaine. So who are you targeting here? Are you targeting kingpins, the ones with the larger grams of powder cocaine, who then have the individuals break that down into crack cocaine? Or are you targeting individuals who can afford the high amounts of powder cocaine, the higher cost of powder cocaine? We saw that powder cocaine was popular among celebrities, whites, and the wealthy and the influential. And so they weren't targeting those populations. Instead, you saw crack cocaine popular among more popular among lower income individuals because it was more a cost-effective drug, as an illustration. So there was this overemphasis in terms of which group of people are you actually using without ever saying anything about race. right? So you see this great disparity with the sentencing. It wasn't until 2010, which is not that long ago, only 10 years ago, that the federal rule in terms of fair sentencing reduced that disparity from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1, which is still a major disparity, right? 18 to 1 ratio now, where crack cocaine still renders a higher sentence. And unfortunately, we went over 20 years with this practice in place of incarcerating Black and Brown Americans for the possession of crack cocaine or the distribution of crack cocaine at much higher sentencing rates. So how do you justify this? How do you make the public accepting of this targeting of crack cocaine? Well, the media played an important role in over-sensationalizing the crack epidemic as a Black problem. You saw that there was a high volume of coverage on arrests, crack arrests, for example, not cocaine arrests, not kingpins and major drug dealers, but instead on crack arrests. You saw the many movies and television shows that began to really hone in on this idea, of crack being a ghetto problem, quote unquote, of crack being a problem of America's urban communities. And so you saw over-policing in those areas for the crack epidemic. But you have to begin to examine, many critics have argued, how is it that in these low-income impoverished communities, how is it that they will begin to be flooded with these drugs in the first place? There are many questions around this. Ironically, many people have failed to engage the history of cocaine and crack. Many people praise the psychologist Sigmund Freud, for example, for his psychological practices and theories. However, they didn't realize that he had an addiction to crack. So he had a cocaine addiction. He was using it in his psychoanalysis and thought that it would be good to use, for instance, and develop a drug problem. He failed to disclose and discuss the side effects of using such a potent drug, which was addiction, for example. But it wasn't just him, although he's praised for in the field of psychology, it wasn't just him. You saw that when we talk about the history of cocaine and the use, this drug came out of European communities, right? European scientists and doctors and so on and so forth, who actually were the ones first experimenting. We know the famous soda company, Coca-Cola, was using the same approach of extracting the cocaine portion from the cocoa plant, extracting the cocaine portion from the cocoa plant and putting it in their product as an illustration, right? And so there's a lot of controversy around this, where people fail to look at the history behind the even creation of what we know of as cocaine as a drug and crack cocaine as another illustration. But there's a long history. Instead, we focus on making the face of the drug crimes and the crack epidemic as a Black face. But because all of this history behind who actually were the ones extracting the cocaine from the cocoa plant as an illustration, and who were using it in science and medicine and so on and so forth, we failed to even broadcast any of that. Instead, we began to over-sensationalize representations of Blacks as the chronic abusers of cocaine and crack cocaine in particular. So we shifted from, we began to create this high volume of coverage on crack arrests, and then media began to create movies and shows like Boys in the Hood, for instance, like New Jack City, with these really violent ghetto-sized representations of Black, highly violent drug criminals as an illustration, right? So it was feeding into the American public psyche and really helped create the Black man as a super predator in terms of the crack epidemic. And for the Black woman, she was represented as supporting of these drug crimes, but also as the crack mama. The crack mama and the crack baby stereotypes emerged during this time frame. You saw it in films that continued on for the next 10 years, from 80 to around 96, for the next 16 years, really, with films like Losing Isaiah, songs like Your Mama's on Crack Rock as an illustration, those types of things. were represented Black women as chronic abusers of crack cocaine, unfit for motherhood, and criminally dangerous. Here's part of the irony, however, is that although the media was largely, news media and television and film media were largely promoting these representations of Black women as chronic criminal abusers of crack cocaine, the majority of women who had given birth to children with cocaine or crack cocaine in their system were in fact white. And the national data demonstrates this. However, many of you, I'm sure, have not even seen this type of research being discussed. It is public information. I challenge you, as we're done with this session, to research it. You can do a simple Google search and you'll find federal data. I'll put the links in a PowerPoint that we shared as well, so you'll be able to directly click on some of the federal links as well. But you'll see that the usage in terms of white women had higher usage rate, and they actually gave birth to children with cocaine or crack cocaine in their system at higher rates than African American women. But yet African American women became the face of the crack problem as women and mothers, and they became the crack mama, quote unquote. And so you saw all of this media coverage around representing the Black woman in this way, and the Black man as this super predator. So you really saw this attack on the Black family structure, right? And justifying this criminal policing, this over criminal policing of the Black community. It's the way in which the American government, the American society really was able to justify its policing and over policing of Black communities for this war on drugs, right? By using the media to focus on these images. You see the image in the background as an illustration, right? Crack kills babies as an illustration. And there's a face of a Black child there. But the majority of babies who were born with cocaine in their system were not in fact Black. And so that's part of the irony, is that the media has been used to falsely portray Black Americans as the primary criminal abusers of crack cocaine and criminal distributors of crack cocaine, when it's not based in any actual evidence. So I encourage you all to take a look at that data. So the PowerPoint will be shared, so you can click on some of those links as well. So that causes us to question, well, are these things that we hold to be true about the criminal justice system in fact true? Well, many scholars, including Michelle Alexander, have argued that these things are false. That many of the things we hold to be true are false. There are several myths about the criminal justice system that we have accepted to be true, given what we have defined it as. However, we see one, there has never been an equality of laws. We see it in something as simple as 101 ratio for the crack versus crack cocaine distribution and possession as an illustration. You saw it in terms of the lack of protection for Black women in terms of sexual violence and sexual crimes against them. The lack of protection of Black men, women, and children for the lynching and criminal assault, the burnings and the terrorism enacted in their communities, the lack of penalty and punishment in those areas. And so that's number two, the lack of equal protection under the laws have not existed either. And so African Americans have, and other communities have said that unfortunately their experience is not you're innocent until proven guilty, but you're guilty until you can prove your innocence, right? And even if you are found innocent, right, and there's a controversial case we can think of like the O.J. Simpson trial, right? Even if you are found innocent, or correction, not guilty, even in that case, you are still presumed guilty as an illustration, right? And so many people have different beliefs about what happened with the O.J. Simpson trial, but the fact of the matter is the jury failed to convict him for those particular crimes, but yet he's still perceived as guilty of those crimes, which is often the case for African Americans and experiences in general. They're perceived guilty of a crime, and the call is that it has been what Du Bois termed the badge of inferiority in the 20th century. He called was the skin color, your tone, your Black skin was your badge of inferiority. African Americans still say that that's your badge of inferiority to this day, that you're presumed guilty simply because of the fact that you are Black, right? Your Black skin is your evidence of guilt. And so you see many cases throughout history and historically where unarmed African American men, women, and children have been killed by police officers, even when police have not been called for them, for instance, or when police have been called to say that there's a mental health crisis, or have been called to say something else is happening. the African American bodies have been unjustly, and their lives have been unjustly taken, but yet the American criminal justice system have found those cases to be justified, as an illustration. And so there is a difference in how we perceive that justification. On the Black community's part, largely it's argued that though the underarmed killing of African American men, women, and children is never justified, but under the criminal justice system, the lack of equal protection under the law renders those actions just. The next thing is, another major myth about the criminal justice system is that the primary function is to keep our streets safe. Remember, I've already mentioned that the majority of arrests are for minor possession, right, of drugs, not actually for violent crimes. And you saw in the previous data slide that arrests for violent crimes are on the decline, while arrests for drug possession and drug paraphernalia were on the incline. So the trends were going in the opposite direction. So are we in fact keeping our streets safe by over-policing for drug possession? The next thing is that the made-for-TV versions is real. It's not in fact real. You see in shows like Law and Order, for example, Criminal Intent, and other shows like that, where a crime happens, a suspect is pursued, charges are brought, they're sentenced, they go through trial, they're sentenced or they plead guilty, and it's over and done. When in actuality, we don't see it happening in one hour, but realistically, we don't see these things happening overnight. We see that the process of the criminal justice system is largely inaccurate as is represented in the media. And the majority of criminal drug arrests are played out. Over 80% of them result in plea deals. And that's self-convictions. And so there's a difference with what's happening in the media representation versus what's happening in real life. And that leads us to the idea of the power of the prosecutor, which I'll talk about shortly. But the power of the prosecutor really controls the narrative around the power that they can render. And the mandatory minimum sentences is really what aids the prosecutor in their ability to be able to control how the public responds to criminal drug arrests, as an illustration. Another thing that I've talked about already was the war on drugs is aimed at kingpins or queenpins. Highly inaccurate, very few, if at all any, in current day drug arrests around major drug distributors. Instead, you find the majority are with minor possession or minor attempted distribution of drugs. Number 6 is that the war on drugs is concerned with dangerous drugs. Well, remember I said 80% of them are for minor possession. The majority of those drug arrests are for minor possession of marijuana, a drug that is proven to be less dangerous, for example, than alcohol use, right? We have seen plenty of studies that demonstrate this, that have been used, the drug that has been used for medical purposes as an illustration as well. And a drug that has been, although federally illegal, has been legalized in California with medical prescription, right? And so, but yet, I don't want anyone walking away and say, well, oh, it's legal here. Remember, it's illegal at the federal level. And so police officers can exercise their discretion when stopping, searching, or arresting for possession of marijuana, even if you have a marijuana prescription card. As an illustration, they can exercise their discretion in that, because at the end of the day, the possession of marijuana is illegal at the federal level. Right? It is not a legally sanctioned drug at the federal level. So the federal law trumps the state law in this case. So do be cognizant of that. And so you do see African Americans in California, for example, African Americans in the Latinx community being highly affected by the war on drugs, the arrest for marijuana, as well as the former 3 strikes rule as well. Although African Americans represent such a small percentage of the population in California, they represented the majority of sentencing under the 25 years to life, the 3 strikes law, as an illustration. And so number 6 is just another illustration that it is not supported by the data. Another faulty myth is that prison equals rehabilitation. We see that many prison services that will render rehabilitation don't exist in majority of American prisons. And 2, once labeled a felon, even if you've gained education while in prison, which is not as commonly practiced as people assume, even if you gain some type of trade or skill while in prison, you're still labeled a felon as an illustration and still lose those citizenship rights that we talked about in one of the earlier slides. And so prison does not necessarily equal rehabilitation when when individuals exit prison in a second-class citizenship status. And finally, the last assumption is that race is not a factor. What we've been discussing today, and we've discussed over the course of the last presentation, how race has continuously been a factor. In fact, I would argue that race has been the primary factor in our criminal justice system since it was created. One, because it was created to police Black bodies. Two, it has continued on that journey of policing Black bodies without equality or equity or justice being rendered for those same Black communities in which they're overly targeted. So I would argue here that this is a major myth, one of the most major myths, because our criminal justice system was very much founded, and the laws that were created were founded on the idea of race being the primary factor. So now that we've talked about how the US government have been able to garner the support of the public in this war on drugs and targeting the Black and Latinx communities, remember I mentioned before that they've incentivized them. So how is it that they have justified this incentivizing? How have they justified, in particular, incentivizing racist policing? Well, the Reagan administration provided law enforcement with financial incentives to devote resources to the war on drugs. And you may be wondering, well, Dr. Gammage, what do you mean they provided financial incentives? Well, the first thing was that law enforcement agencies can keep the vast majority of cash and assets seized in the war on drugs. So those iconic images of the money on the table, right, as an illustration, they get to keep 80% of that, of the vast majority, and it goes back into their unit. The houses that are seized under the war on drugs, cars, jewelry, furs, those iconic images you see highly broadcast in the media, they oftentimes do what's called police auctions. They're able to auction off those things for profit and keep 80% of that, or the vast majority of that. And so that's a major incentive for law enforcement to fight a war on drugs, even if there's not a real war, right? Because it's financially profitable for them. And then you see the Byron Grant laws gave law enforcement millions of dollars to pursue justice in the war on drugs, right? And so as a result of this, you get millions of dollars in grants and you get to keep 80% of the cash and assets. That's a major incentive to pursue a certain to pursue the war on drugs, one, but then two, to accept the war on drugs being a Black and brown problem. So you're over-policing certain communities because it's profitable to do so, not because there's actually a greater drug problem. And we'll see if there is there or is there not a greater drug problem in these Black and brown communities. So the first thing we want to look at is how do we get those arrest numbers up? Well, through the power of the prosecutor, we see that bad deals are forced. Nearly all criminal cases are resolved through plea bargains. That's over 80% of them, where individuals self-convict, because what prosecutors have is the power to leverage those mandatory minimum sentences, right? And so by saying that, take 5 years, or I'll pursue you for the mandatory 10 or mandatory 25 to life, as an illustration, or take the felony record in 2 years, or I'll pursue you for the minimum 5-year penalty, individuals are more inclined to accept, especially when they have poor defense counsels, as an illustration. We see that public defenders are the primary ones defending individuals with drug cases. So individuals have not been able to afford their own lawyers. And so what you see is that underfunded public defenders oftentimes having an overload of cases. If you ever had the unfortunate pleasure of sitting in, or have done it for experimental purposes, sitting in the criminal court proceedings and sit in for a day and just watch. Well, not during the pandemic, but once this is all over, but sit in for a day and just watch the criminal proceedings, you'll see defense attorneys come in having never met their clients, calling out their names, looking around the courtroom for them, wondering who they are, haven't fully read their cases, and walk away with pleas, all in front of you in a matter of minutes. So you did not know who I was a minute ago, and now you're telling me take the plea, as an illustration. And so these bad deals are largely forced because the prosecutor has the power to leverage those mandatory minimums against a person. And as a result, they'll take the felony record in a lesser sentence versus taking a longer term sentence for minor possession of a crime. So as a result of that, they're really being denied meaningful representation. And 80% of criminal defendants are unable to pay for their own lawyer. And so they're heavily relying on public defenders. And so you might have heard the iconic term public defenders is actually public pretenders. I don't know if you all have heard that type of terminology used, because the assumption is that they are pretending to represent your best interest when in fact they are unable to do so. Those offices tend to be underfunded, overcased, have a high level of case loads, and oftentimes don't have the time dedicated to properly serve individuals. This 80% of the defendants, right, properly serve them. And so the prosecutor leverages that power in order to yield the results that they want in this war on drugs. When you look at, well, how do they even get in the courtroom, for instance? Well, you see the population in terms of the police searches. So in the chart to your right, you'll see that police search a portion of whites versus black drivers, right? Search black drivers at a higher rate. Contraband hit rate, for example. Once searched, whites were more likely to be caught carrying some type of drugs or guns, for example. However, with the arrest rates, blacks were more likely to be arrested during these traffic stops, despite the fact that whites were more likely to be in possession of drugs or illegal guns, as an illustration. And so this is how you over-police blacks and you over-punish them for the same crimes that whites are committing, and whites get a lesser penalty, and oftentimes result in less arrests. So with the pressure to increase the war on drugs, you saw the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 issued. And it was largely linked to the crack cocaine epidemic, quote unquote. And what you also saw, because we gave you the ratios that came out of that as well, the 100 to 1, it was also issued in those mandatory minimums. And you begin to see later on when Clinton introduced he wanted his tough on crime bills and introduced the 3 strikes rules and 3 strikes laws, which heavily impacted Black and Latino communities. And as a result, we saw the major increase of the self-convictions. Those mandatory minimal sentences became a really powerful bargaining chip that's still used to this day to usher people into the prison industrial complex. Unfortunately, individuals when they're being encouraged to take these pleas and self-convictions, they're not being fully disclosed of all of the outcomes that, as a result of this, they may be getting a felony record. As a result of this, the felony record means second-class citizenship in America. So you're able to usher in millions into the prison industrial complex through these mandatory minimum sentences and through self-convictions. And that's the power of the prosecutor to be able to force these bad deals. So the next thing to look at is how those mandatory sentencing laws, they're not just a bargaining chip or a way to leverage power, but we see that the felony drug charges equal longer sentences as well. So you can be pursued for felony drug charges for the possession or attempted distribution of drugs that have been proven to be less dangerous, right? This was upheld by the Supreme Court. So these are, and this happened under Clinton's administration with the 3 strikes and you're out, right? In 94. And so while the Clintons have kind of tried to step away from this policy, they kept it into practice while Clinton was in office. And it wasn't until Hillary Clinton's campaign for presidency that they began to retract and say that they made a mistake. But that mistake cost millions of African Americans and Latinos their lives to the prison industrial complex. So that was a major mistake that African Americans the Latinx communities have argued what is not a cost they're willing to bear once again. You see, the primary affects those found guilty of nonviolent crimes. That's part of the irony in all of this, is that it's assumed that these tough policies around drug crimes have to do with violent drug crimes. They, in fact, are nonviolent. Possession is considered a nonviolent drug crime, as an illustration. Although some philosophers idealize that or theorize that possession and use of these drugs do have violent consequences on the individual and the families. The federal law does not consider possession a violent drug crime. So these are, in fact, non-violent drug crimes, and the majority of the drug arrests under the war on drugs that continues to this day are for non-violent criminal offenses. So the war on drugs is directly linked to a war on race. In at least 15 states, African Americans are admitted to prison on drug charges at the rate of 20 to 57 times greater than that of whites, based on the Human Rights Report from 2000. Excuse me. The assumption would be that then, therefore, African Americans must in fact use and sell drugs at a higher rate. Highly inaccurate. The next point is that although the majority of illegal drug users and dealers nationwide are white, 3/4 of all people in prison for drug offenses have been Black and Latino, right? So you can check out the Human Rights Watch report from 2000 and later ones that show the same things. In 2000, the National Institute of Drug Abuse reported that white students, 1, used cocaine at 7 times the rate of Black students, 2, use crack cocaine at 8 times the rate of Black students, 3, use heroin at 7 times the rate of Black students, and similar rates exist between 5 and 7 times the rate for marijuana. So the assumption that, oh, Black people just use drugs more, highly inaccurate. The national data speaks to this, and the current national data shows the exact same types of measurements, that whites have a higher rate of drug usage and drug sales than African Americans. The National Household Survey on Drug Abuse in 2000 reported that white youth between 12 and 17 are more than a third more likely to have sold drugs than African American youth. And so why is it then that African Americans are being targeted as the criminal drug offenders? Why is it that we have shows, television shows, we have media coverage, news reports showing young African American males primarily as the corner boys and the local drug dealers as an illustration, when in fact white youth sell drugs more a third more likely to sell drugs, than African American youth? Why are those same images not represented of white youth, and why are white youth arrested at a much lower rate? Well, this has to do with the concept of over-policing Black bodies and the adultification of Black children. Black children are seen 3 to 7 times older than they actually are. Then the over-policing in our schools. We heard of the school of prison pipeline, where, and that's part of the reason why we're calling for the police to come out of our public schools. They're not represented in majority white schools as they are in majority Black and Latinx schools. Instead, you see children are forced to walk through metal detectors, have armed police officers at their campuses for disturbances in class or assumed disturbances in class. Police officers throw them out of their chairs, drag them out of the class, physically beat them, and so on and so forth, arrest them. They're sent to juvenile detention centers at a much higher rate, as an illustration, than white youth. In fact, the majority of these juvenile detention centers are populated by Black and Latinx youth for simple, quote unquote, disturbances in the classrooms. And so there's this racialized treatment of Black children, what makes the educational environment another terrorizing environment, because they're being overly policed in these schools as well. You see mountains of data showing how Black children are more likely to be arrested, charged, convicted, and incarcerated for non-violent, non-drug related crimes while in school, as an illustration. If you take the case of Gina 6 in Louisiana, the 6 young Black males who were charged with attempted murder after an incident at school where they were being harassed and racially targeted and the noose was being hung, there was a fight between white boys and black boys on campus, and the black boys were charged and said that their tennis shoes were in fact a weapon used for attempted murder. And so this is part of, I laugh because this is part of the irony. And since when does the tennis shoe become a weapon? It only becomes a weapon when you adultify a child, when you see that child as inherently criminal, when that child is black. And so by looking at this in relation to race, you see how there's this over-targeting of black children and misrepresentation of black children as criminal offenders, such that when police officers kill unarmed black children, even while sleeping, America is unmoved, right? Things don't change. Instead, we have to see black child after black child after black child killed unarmed by police officers, and there's tends to be never enough outrage. And this is part of the reason why the Black Lives Matter movement was launched, because black lives have been consistently portrayed in American society as having no value other than free labor, right? And as a result of that, then the representation of black children as criminal and the primary face of criminal drug sellers and dealers is promoted, despite the fact that the data shows that white youth are more likely to have sold drugs than African American youth. So race is in fact a factor. And not only is it a factor based on the data, it's a factor based on the US Supreme Court's ruling. The US Supreme Court had actually granted the police license to discriminate through racial profiling. Race-based policing is acceptable, and race can be used as a factor in making discretionary decision-making, including deciding who to stop. So race can be used as a sole factor and as a multiple of factors. As an illustration, this took place in the US v. Ponce court case, where it concluded it was permissible under equal protection clause for the police to use race as a factor in making decisions about who to stop and search. So remember that previous chart where I showed you African Americans are stopped more often, that they are searched more often, and they are arrested despite whites having more of drugs and guns on them, right? It's because US v. Ponce made this perfectly legal. So even if a person said prior to this case, African Americans were suing law enforcement officers for racial profiling. Well, the US Supreme Court then made that almost impossible to take place by making it permissible to use race as a factor. And so while race is not popular to say, yes, I racially profile, instead, police officers designate their actual stopping practices to, oh, it was the location that you were in, it was the time of night, it was something like age, your attire, etc. Right? This is a known drug area, as an illustration. So part of the irony is that if you over-police an area for drug crimes, it becomes a known drug area. Versus if you fail to police in areas with high drug use, those areas are not known drug areas. And so there's this racialized targeting of African Americans that's actually been considered constitutionally acceptable. And so this is a major reason why people say skin color is not a reasonable suspicion, but according to the US Supreme Court, it is in fact an acceptable measure for discretionary decision making. I want you all to keep that in mind as you think about the data that we're looking at here, and that there's this over targeting of African Americans in terms of policing because it's considered acceptable and legal and just. So we see that dozens of studies have shown that racial cues are perceived within a fraction of a second, whether or not the perceiver intends to do so or not, because American society has already socialized the public, not just the police force, but the public, and the public becomes the police force, right? The public becomes the criminal justice system. But they have socialized to see African Americans as inherently criminal, right? So if you see African Americans as inherently criminal, their black skin is the crime, then you over police them, such that in a fraction of a second, you have a negative perception of black bodies immediately. In a fraction of a second, you see a black body as a weapon. In a fraction of a second, you have weaponized black men, women, and children who are unarmed with their hands up, whose backs are turned, who's on the ground, who are asleep. They're immediately weaponized, right? Even when they're in handcuffs, you see them as a threat. because you've been socialized to see African bodies in this way, that being Black is the threat. And so as a result of that, Black racial cues rapidly activate negative information in memory, right? And so where did this memory come from? Remember I told you about all of those different shows, the rap music videos, the news broadcasts, the movies that have represented Black bodies as violent, as criminally negligent, as criminally unfit, as threatening to the American public, right? You look at reality television shows where you're constantly seeing things like Basketball Wives, Love and Hip Hop as an illustration, where you're constantly showing Black women being violent in public spaces. That is socializing the public to see Black women as dangerous to the public. And so those racialized cues are being activated as the American public interacts or faces Black men, women, and children. And there's unfortunately not enough cultural and racial training in the police department to be able to control for that. And the truth is, part of the problem is that the police system itself was designed to uphold these racial cues and these racial perceptions, right? And so you continue to get this targeting of African Americans and Black bodies as the criminals of America. As a result of this, African Americans have had to take a stance once again to say, this is unacceptable and we can no longer tolerate this type of systematic racist assault and terrorism against our humanity. And so African Americans have launched through three women and created in 2013 the Black Lives Matter movement as a practical Black-oriented movement of political and social empowerment. It's really designed to invoke in the nation and in the international audience a call for justice for Black lives, to see Black lives as equally important, equally human, and equally entitled to human rights. And so unfortunately, there's been backlash, and we'll talk about momentarily, but the movement is not about Black supremacy. The movement is about the equality of Black lives, about the value of Black lives. So Black Lives Matter is an ideology and a political intervention in a world where Black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise. It is an affirmation of Black folks' humanity, our contributions to society, and our resilience in the face of daily oppression. The global movement has over 40 chapters nationally and billions of supporters globally. The momentum of the movement has led to local and national protests and legislative reform agendas. However, while started in 2013, we still see the need and presence of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, and we'll see it next year and the years to come until we move to a more anti-racist society, anti-racist policing practices, and anti-racist targeting in terms of these quote unquote war on drugs and the elimination of mass incarceration of Black and Latinx bodies. There's been major backlash, unfortunately, to the Black Lives Matter movement. We see that social protests were met with military grade violence, weapons, and machinery, right? And so remember, these are non-violent protests, right? Oftentimes have been permitted, these permits have been granted in many cases to host these protests, but they've been met with military grade violence. We see several videos surface of officers threatening to take lives of non-violent, unarmed protesters. The simple act of asking for and demanding equality and justice in a society becomes a threat to that society, says that we have a serious racial problem in America. Military tanks rolled out into Black communities, posing a vicious threat to the lives of citizens. Tear gas and beanbags were shot into crowds filled with Black children, women, men, and allied communities. We saw pregnant women thrown to the ground. We saw children being tear gassed. We saw Black men, women, and children being pulled and dragged off. This is very similar to the treatment of Blacks during the civil rights era, as an illustration, where there was lack of justice, and that call for justice was met with violence and terrorism. You also see the counter movement of All Lives Matter and White Lives Matter counter movements. Ironically, and this may be controversial, but I'll go forth with it anyway. Ironically, while there's the All Lives Matter movement, those same individuals from the All Lives Matter movement are not also taken to the streets during the Black Lives Matter protests to say that, yes, Black Lives Matter. They're not taken to the street during Latinx protests and saying Latinx lives matter. They're not taken to the street during Pride and LGBTQ plus community protests saying these communities' lives matter. Instead, they're most often found defending and standing up for police officers accused of unjustly killing unarmed African-American men, women, and children. So there's an irony here. And so African-Americans have had to defend their position of Black Lives Matter by pointing to the fact that pro-Black is not anti-white, right? That African-Americans have a right to want to maintain and celebrate their humanity, right? And demand that society in which they live in, pay taxes in, work to build, and in fact built, right? Respects them as human beings and as citizens. They have a right to demand that, and yet unfortunately have been met with major backlash. Jessica, how am I doing on time?
You have 25 more minutes, Dr. Gammage.
Okay, perfect, thank you. We see countless officers were recorded threatening to kill nonviolent protesters for recording their terroristic tactics used against them. And for those of you all who joined us new today, I was laying out how policing have been used as terrorism against African Americans in this country historically, and how those same practices inform the policing here in the 21st century today. So that's why here I say these terroristic tactics, because they are nonviolent protesters. They're using military grade and military approaches to disband peaceful nonviolent protests. You also see that U.S. military has been brought in. You see it happening now, right? Although the news coverage is no longer saying that this is newsworthy, these protests have been going on for over 50 days in these communities, and yet they're no longer newsworthy. But what ironically what's happening is military has moved into these communities, right? And so it begs the question of, is the news media no longer interested, or is the news media being forced to report less now that the military is forced into these communities as well for nonviolent peaceful protests? Part of the irony with the protests is that the assumption is that, oh, these are violent protests. They are potentially violent people here. Well, this is one of the first time in American history where news reporters are actually identifying the fact, and not all, but some, identifying the fact that the majority of protesters who are being recorded and arrested for violence at these protests happen to be non-Black. They in fact happen to be white. Many people don't realize with the LA riots, for instance, in the 1990s, that the majority of individuals arrested during that time frame were not Black. They were white, and they were from outside Black communities, right? And they were largely they were from outside of Los Angeles area. So people don't see that at arrest record data, but instead they label the face of violent protests in the LA riots, the Watts riots, as Black, right? And you see currently the news media has been reporting how a lot of the violence that has been present, which has not been much, but has been present in the current protests, have not come on the part of Black Americans, right? Have largely come from the part of white Americans, right? And so we can see that also in the current arrest record data as well. So we have to look at these things and say, how are these movements being labeled in this way when it's not, in fact, these local community members who are enacting violence on these protests, but that they're designed to be peaceful protests, but disruptive. Remember, the power of the protest is to disrupt the normal social order of things. So they're designed to disrupt. They're not designed to be violent. But I must say, and this may be controversial as well, but I must say that to enact terrorism and violence against the people and expect them to never defend themselves with violence is psychotic, right? Remember, you're talking about military tanks, you're talking about military weapons being used. You saw during the 60s, water hoses, dogs, beatings, guns being used against African-American men, women, and children, right? You saw their houses being burned, you saw them being lynched. You saw them being terrorized in schools. You saw their churches being bombed. And yet the assumption that African Americans should never respond with any violence is wholly inaccurate, right? We have to look at what's taking place here. In a war, you tend not to find one group with not using any violent tactics to defend themselves, while the other group uses advanced military grade weapons, right, to advance their agenda. So we have to begin to question this. What is violence? And we don't have to answer this today, but can violence actually be an appropriate measure when terrorism is being used against a group of people? Violent terrorism is being used against them for their nonviolent actions or for their call for justice. We have to begin to interrogate those ideas. When you see this level of hyper-violence used against a people, and they're supposed to continue to lay down and be killed. There's a level of psychology that you have to question, is that psychologically sound to believe? So I challenge us to think about that. You don't have to come up with the answers in your mind today, but I challenge you to think about that. Whether at times violence is acceptable. But Nat Turner, for instance, when they were rebelling, him and the group rebelled in 1831, they saw that violence was a necessary means to secure their freedom and the freedom of their families and communities, the freedom of Blacks during enslavement. Violence was used as an appropriate tactical measure to protect themselves and to defend their humanity. And we continue to see high military terroristic tactics used against African Americans at this time. So while controversial, we have to begin to beg the question. African Americans have utilized a higher moral authority and said that we will not respond with violence, right? You've seen this largely practiced. You saw it in the civil rights era. But at some point, we have to begin to question, are those legitimate means to protect communities who are being terrorized? The final note on this one, to the backlash, is that the criminal justice system has repeatedly failed to bring charges against officers who have unjustly killed Blacks. And when charged, routinely acquitted these individuals. And so if you think about it, then while there's a call for justice, many have not been able to articulate what justice actually looks like in America for African Americans, because they haven't seen it before, right? And so while they say justice is, for example, for now, arresting these individuals, it doesn't end there. Justice have to be also finding them guilty, and also then not just guilty, but sentencing them to with the appropriate sentencing. We'll see in the next slide how, unfortunately, in many of these cases, there have been inappropriate sentences issued out to show that Black lives do not matter. And so justice, even when considered rendered, has not been appropriately rendered. So take, for instance, how injustice in the law enforcement, there's a disproportionate number of Blacks killed by police officers, have been unarmed, yet the majority of these cases have closed without indictment or convictions, right? Even in cases where Black men have been laying on their backs, their hands up, unarmed, said, I'm not a threat, you weren't even called for me, I'm here to support my patient, have been shot, charges have not been rendered against those officers, right? So the criminal justice system have failed the Black community. So justice, the reason why people can't articulate what justice is because the criminal justice system may not, in its current form, be able to even render justice. According to policeviolence.org, police killed at least 104 unarmed Black people in 2015, nearly twice each week. And nearly 1 in 3 Black people killed by police in 2015 were identified as unarmed, though the actual number is likely higher due to underreporting. And we know that that's the case. Take a look at the Breonna Taylor case and how there was underreporting, right, in terms of the actual incident that took place in her case. The Mapping Police Violence Report also reported that 6% of unarmed people killed by police were Black in 2015, despite Black people being only 13% of the US population. That is a major disparity, right? And unarmed Black people were killed at 5 times the rate of unarmed whites in 2015. We've seen countless video cases of officers enacting more socially acceptable engagements with white individuals, even when armed. There's one of those videos that kind of went viral of the white doctor armed, pointing his gun at several police officers in his medical facility. And the police officers being told to stand down, do not shoot. They were able to apprehend him without incident. However, unarmed Black men and women and children with their hands up, asleep, asking not to be killed, saying that they cannot breathe, lives have been taken. And so you see these cases where there was another viral video that went out. I don't know if you all seen this one, where the white male college student was later found to be high on drugs. The police was called, and he was tasered after they tried to subdue him several times, after he assaulted officers. And then they warned him that we're going to tase you. Stop, we're going to tase you. Repeatedly, he was then tased, and then later no charges were brought against him, as an illustration. And so this is just some of the incidents comparing the treatment of Black lives versus white lives when the police, and how they enact their policing practices. So police brutality has been a major factor in how Black bodies are policed versus white bodies. Police brutality is highly practiced among, it's much highly practiced among the treatment of police officers against Blacks than it is against whites. And the data speaks for itself on those matters. So you see this call saying that if there's no justice, there cannot be peace in American society. How can African Americans feel safe, peaceful, comfortable to pursue the American dream if everyday living, sleeping, right? Going to work, going to school, stepping out of your door, being inside your home, for instance, may result in your life being taken. So there's a constant level of fear that exists among African Americans to have to live in a society where they have to live in constant fear that their lives will be taken and there will never be justice in a system of injustice. Take, for instance, in 2015, because we gave that data, only 13 out of those 104 cases that I mentioned where unarmed Black people were killed by police officers resulted in officers being charged with the crime. And so it tells the public that officers are just in these practices, right? That only 13 out of 104, right, were arrested. 4 of these cases have ended with mistrial or charges against the officers being dropped, right? So now we're down to 9. Only 4 cases have resulted in convictions of officers involved, with the fifth case resulting in the officer pleading guilty. So 4 of them got convictions. Of those 4 cases, right, remember we were at 13, now only 4 of them resulted in convictions, right, or the officer pleading guilty. So really it was 3 convictions. Of the 4 cases where officers were involved, have been convicted and sentenced. None were sentenced to serve more than 4 years in prison. In fact, 1 was allowed to serve their time exclusively on the weekends, right? Talk about justice. Is that justice? Right? 1 was sentenced to only 3 months in jail. And the penalty for the 1 who pled guilty resulted in 20 years. So this sends the message to officers not to plead guilty, even when they are in fact guilty of an unjust killing. Because it's better for you, it's statistically better for you to plead not guilty. You're more likely to not have charges brought against you. If you do have charges brought against you, you're more likely to get those charges dropped or have some type of minimum ridiculous sentence that you could potentially serve on the weekend. What does that say to the Black community about their lives and the value of their lives? It says nothing other than Black lives have no value in America, and it will not be valued in the criminal justice system. Hence the need to say Black lives matter, and we want change and reform in American society. And that may come through a multitude of means. Media continues to play an important role in enacting injustice by falsely representing these cases, by falsely representing African Americans as criminal, and by promoting some political and social propaganda that disadvantages African Americans. In cases of on-duty shootings by police officers, both news media and social media have played a vital role in the promotion of images about victims and about officers. Take, for instance, in the case of Michael Brown, the media was quick to show and release footage that the officer had no knowledge of was perceived to be a strong arm robbery. Could very well also be perceived to be shoplifting, or could also be perceived to be a financial transaction. Remember, in that video, many people failed to see that Michael Brown, in fact, paid the store clerk for the product as an illustration. Many people failed to see that, but news media was very quick to begin to paint Michael Brown, to paint Trayvon Martin, and to paint many other and every other Black and brown body as criminal in order to justify. They were really playing an important role in helping to justify the officer's actions. So they helped socialize the public into saying, well, yes, that officer was right to suspect that something was going on with Michael Brown. Yes, George Zimmerman was right to suspect that something was going on with Trayvon Martin, a child who was murdered, right? So you see these, yes, and on George Floyd's case, yes, he was, the store clerk had a reason to bring the police in. He was using counterfeit money that was later found not to, in fact, be counterfeit, right? And so there's some irony in all of this, right? You're taking Black lives for these assumptions, and news media play an important role with promoting fake news about African Americans, or over promoting African Americans as violent, vicious, terroristic individuals, and therefore the violence used against them by police is justified. You see, on the opposite end, they're not only showing Black bodies as criminal, right, even when they're asleep, as an illustration, but they're showing white officers as upstanding citizens as an illustration, right? They're pictured in their uniforms, they're pictured with their families, and so on and so forth. They're being pictured in a way that paints them as upstanding officers, good people, right? And so there's this parallel between the representations that really affects how the public sees African Americans and police officers and the treatment of African Americans by police officers. In effect, an overwhelming majority of the Black victims have been negatively framed in the media as violent, criminal, aggressive, and a perceived threat to the public. While the officers and neighborhood monitors, quote unquote, who have been predominantly white, have been represented as upstanding public servants. So there's a great disparity between the representation between these two groups. And so the media play an important role in promoting these images and continuously socializing the American public into accepting this mistreatment of Black bodies. These racially biased messages have informed public perceptions of the victims and have been used to validate the state's failure to indict or convict officers in the cases of unarmed African Americans, right? Essentially, their Blackness is the reason why they were killed. And that Blackness is, in fact, a violent threat, according to the news media and the American criminal justice system. And so African Americans have to call for justice. And we call on our ally communities, our supporter, our sister and brother communities, our neighborhood communities to be able to support these calls. You see a major call to demand for an anti-racist society. And what we're meaning is no longer is it acceptable to say, well, I'm not a racist. What we're calling for is to say, you have to actively be anti-racist and work towards dismantling the systems of racism embedded in the very structures and institutions of America. We have embedded in American society institutional racism. And within those institutions, every sector of life for every human group is affected by race. Your ability to exist without fear of your life being taken on a daily basis is determined by your race in American society. Your ability to pursue education without being demonized, ostracized, targeted, policed in the classroom, on school grounds, around your school is determined by your race. Your ability to secure employment is determined by your race. Your ability to secure quality housing or any housing a loan to be able to purchase a home. All of these things are being determined by your race in American society. And so we have a racist society that has been built since its very formation. It was built in this ideology of white supremacy, and it continues to this day. So there is a demand to transform American society to a more just, equal, and anti-racist society, right? In which those policies and practices no longer are based on race, not just alone, race alone, but no longer based in race. And that leads to the continuous call, because one of the pressing issues that we see is the current state of policing, right? The creation of policing, the ongoing tactics of policing, and the current state of policing have led to the call to defund the police. Many people see this as controversial. Well, who will protect us from violent crime? Well, the data shows that the majority of arrests, only 9 in 10 of all arrests are for non-violent crimes or non-crimes at all. Only 1 out of 10 are in fact for violent crimes. So this idea that there's just this major issue of violence that exists in American society that calls for this over-policing to take place, especially in Black communities, is just wholly inaccurate. In some Black communities, it's less than 5% of all service calls are in fact for violent crimes, as an illustration. So the defund the police is a call to reallocate the resources, being the billions of dollars being put into the police force that have not invested those billions into restructuring itself to be a more equitable and just system, but to take that funding, since it has failed to do its job to protect and serve, right? Since it's failed to do that, to take those funds and redirect them to community-based support systems. Those support systems around mental health, education, for example, healthcare, and so on and so forth. We have to think about our first responders. The call to defund police is about allocating resources to the appropriate first responders. In cases of mental health crisis, when first responders have been police officers, we've just seen this recently, right? Where mental health crisis, where we continue to see this among African Americans, where they unfortunately have resulted in their death because police officers have responded with violence in a mental health crisis. If they're not trained to be mental health responders, the call is to take that funding from them and put it into mental health responders, right? In terms of healthcare crisis, for instance, when police officers show up in health crisis, when police officers show up in those situations, we've unfortunately seen African Americans seeking medical aid being shot and killed, right? Being arrested while seeking medical aid, and so on and so forth. And so there's a huge issue here, and that's why they call it to take that funding from the police departments and move it. Some question, well, how do we exist in a society without police? Well, the reality is African Americans are largely targeted by police, and the remainder of society, in particular, let me correct that, and not just the remainder, but in particular, white communities are not policed in these terroristic manners. And therefore, there is a contradiction in the policing, and that's why people are so confused about why we would need to defund police, right? There's a legitimate distrust of the police by Black and brown communities because of the terrorism enacted against them. And as a result, they're calling to take those funding away from police, since the police have failed to serve their communities, have failed to protect their communities, take that funding away and put it into the appropriate community-based resources needed to uplift those communities. And the next one is the call for reparations. The call for reparations, just like the call to defund police, because the defund police is not a new one. It's been going on since the early 1920s, right? And so the call for reparations is one of those that have been going on since emancipation as well. And so the call for reparations is about paying, not just monetarily, but reimbursing African Americans and their generations of children for the pain, suffrage, for the discrimination, the mistreatment that America, not individuals, but that the American society has rendered against them. American society, right, enslaved, have segregated, and incarcerated African Americans unfairly and intentionally, right? And so that call for reparations includes a monetary, financial payout. It includes access to free quality education without subject of policing and miseducation or Eurocentric education, right? So they want free access to public higher education institutions. Not uncommon. You see this among some indigenous populations being granted access to these things. Another one is the call for, in terms of reparation, is the call for housing, the ability to secure home ownership in American society. We know about the historical legacy. One, during enslavement, you could not own. Two, during Jim Crow, you were restricted to Black zones, you were restricted to Black communities, and so on and so forth. Then the subprime lending, the racially biased lending practices, the higher interest rate in Black communities, and so on and so forth, undervaluing Black communities. So there's a call for to be able to secure land, not just home ownership, but land for African Americans, right? Another part of that call is a national apology, national acceptance and a national apology, right? And while this call has been going on for a while, we have not seen a national apology issue, right? And from a president as an illustration. The next thing is that there needs to be a rewriting of the American history to include the truths of all the people, right? No longer do African Americans, Indigenous Americans, Latinx Americans, for example, want the history of their peoples told from a Eurocentric Americanized lens, right? Where Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, blah, 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 right? We no longer want that faulty narrative told to our children and promoted. People are saying no more do they want to see a Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade, right? Because it contradicts the terroristic reality that indigenous Black and brown bodies have faced in American society, as an illustration. And so these are some of the things that call for reparations is about. It's about correcting the injustices that have been done for over 400 years, and about seeing racism that has been embedded in the institution as a public crisis, a public health crisis, a public education crisis, a public economic crisis, a public social crisis, and a public cultural crisis, as an illustration. And the call and a political crisis. That call is to reframe our society altogether, which will take a lot of work. But that's why the protests have been nonstop. That's why the protests have taken it continues to move itself to the legislative agendas and so on and so forth, because we know that in order to change American society, we have to change its very structures in which the society operates and exists. We have to change the laws and the way we operate. We have to change the systems of oppression that exist. And the oppression that exists in the systems that we operate in every day. And so this call for justice is an ongoing, repeated call, and it doesn't just end with defunding the police, because the police have operated as terrorists against Black communities, but it's about transforming society to be anti-racist and repairing the wrongs that have been done to African Americans, and which will never be fully repaired. But there are a multitude of items that American society could effectively address. So thank you all for joining us for the second workshop. And at this point, I'll give you a second to contemplate any questions that you may have, and we can dive into those. Thank you.
Does anybody have, I know that it's 12:33, so just want to be mindful of your time, but Dr. Gammage, are you open to a comment or a question?
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay.
Hello.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Julio Lima. I'm a lecturer in criminal justice and criminology, and a very interesting lecture. I just want to take an issue about the violence that is occurring with the drug trade. I'm a police officer, retired police officer. I worked in South Central Los Angeles. I still live in South Central Los Angeles. And during the whole crack cocaine craze, Black men, women, and children were gunned down in the streets here in Los Angeles every weekend. Every weekend. I was there at the crime scenes. I had the blood on my uniform. I had people die in front of me. That motivated a lot of the police response. Um, Something that's not mentioned often is the response, the law enforcement response. A lot of it was motivated by Black elected officials who were the representatives of this area, seeing that crime was out of control. So I just want to say this violence that is occurring is not a Hollywood artifact, and that's accepting all the differences with crack cocaine and powder cocaine. And I'm glad that you mentioned the role of the Clintons, both husband and wife, in this whole mass incarceration issue. But I don't think that we can minimize the amount of violence that was going on in these communities with the drug trade. It wasn't just benign people selling drugs and then being victimized by police.
Thank you. I appreciate your comment and your input. One of the things that I was pointing to in terms of the crime is crime was based on arrest. And so we're talking about the arrest rates here. The arrest rates were much higher and more prevalent in those communities. And yes, you're absolutely correct that many Black political leaders were calling for an increase in law enforcement in those areas where there were high levels of violence and homicide. You still see some of them calling for this in certain communities today where the homicide rates are extremely high in certain communities. One of the things that we can't ignore is that homicide rates in terms of Black on Black crime are very similar to homicide rates and other crime rates in terms of white on white crime and white on white homicide. It's just that the media has focused more on those homicide rates in Black communities as if they don't exist at similar rates in white communities. The reality is the data shows us, the national data shows us that whites kill whites at the same rate of Black kills rates. It's intercommunity violence. And that intercommunity violence still exists in a very much an issue that still must be addressed, yes. But it's to say that it exists in isolation in Black communities is wholly inaccurate. I know that's not what you're saying, but I'm saying that that's the perception, the media perception, the perception around policing that has been promoted is that this violence exists almost exclusively in Black and brown communities, of brown on brown and Black on brown and Black on Black crime, when those crime levels exist and those violent crime levels exist at similar rates in white communities. Unfortunately, while you saw the crack epidemic being promoted during the 1980s, 1990s, now you see, the opioid crisis. It's about how we're framing these conversations, right? Here's a drug crisis happening in a Black community, now called a crack epidemic, deemed to be violent, deemed to be vicious, deemed to be a threat to the public, right? The public safety, versus the opioid epidemic, for example, being termed the opioid crisis, where unsuspecting innocent white folks are falling victim to drug addiction. And as a result, them being treated as individuals who are suffering from a health crisis and receiving health services, versus in Black communities, what we see is that they're being criminalized and for possession of drugs and for use of drugs. And as a result of that, then the policing tactics used against them, and it doesn't end with the policing, it moves beyond that. The prosecution of them is not the same treatment that you see in white communities. Instead of being offered rehabilitation services, rehab, addiction counseling, and so on and so forth, you see them ushered into prison for possession of drugs, versus in white communities and with the quote unquote opioid crisis, you see them being ushered into to rehabilitation services. As an illustration, the data speaks for itself in terms of the number of babies born with crack cocaine in their systems being primarily born from white women. That, the data doesn't lie in that sense, but yet Black women became the face of the crack mother, right? Black babies became the face of crack babies. And so there's a difference in the representation, as a result, the treatment and who's targeted in these terms of these communities. Yes, I think you're absolutely correct in pointing out that there has been a high level of violence in these drug wars, these community drug wars, as an illustration, but they do not exist in silo. They have existed in multiple racial groups of communities in America.
And I agree, it is 100% true. And I think, you know, like I said, I live in the community. I see this in my own eyes. I got a different perspective on a lot of the issues that you've talked about. But I think sometimes we're in a state of denial about the violence that is occurring in our community and who the victims are.
Can everyone else hear me?
I think it's getting a little.
I'm sorry, I was having trouble hearing your last statement, but I think you were welcoming the conversation to continue at another time. I'll be happy to continue to engage you. I do appreciate you sharing your perspective. Thank you.
So with that, we'll just go ahead and wrap up because I know it's a little bit over 12:30, but just want to thank you so much, Dr. Gammage, for these amazing and powerful presentations. Thank you to our interpreters for providing the services, and thank you all to the participants for engaging in this conversation. And I really hope that we can take what we learn and apply it into our respective areas, our homes, our communities, and etc. So thank you, Dr. Gammage.
Thank you so much. Thank you all once again for joining us. Continue to be safe and well.